Good afternoon, distinguished guests and colleagues. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event titled Financing Europe's Sustainable Future, Progress, Challenges and Opportunities for Development, hosted here at the European Parliament and online. As president of Red Española de Desarrollo Sostenible, REDS-SDSN Spain, it's an honor to organize and host this event in collaboration with the SDSN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the European Parliament, with a special thanks to Leire Pajín, who promoted and facilitated this space, making it possible. Today, we are privileged to have a diverse group of experts, policymakers, and stakeholders joining us from across Europe. This event marks an important opportunity to engage in a meaningful dialogue about the critical challenges we are currently facing in financing sustainable development, while also exploring the innovative solutions that can drive Europe's progress towards the 2030 Agenda. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todas las personas que nos acompañáis aquí en la sala y a todas aquellas personas que nos estáis siguiendo a través de nuestro canal. Un especial saludo, un caluroso saludo a los miembros de nuestra red española de desarrollo sostenible. Advertir también que contáis con traducción simultánea. Now, I would like to introduce Leire Pajín, a member of the European Parliament, whose dedication to sustainable development and to advancing the European Union's commitment to the SDGs continues to inspire us. Please.
Thank you so much, Estivali. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be among friends today. Thank you so much for being here. For me, it's a very special event. It's wonderful to see you, to see many of you. Quiero también empezar dándole un saludo a quienes nos siguen desde las redes, sobre todo a los miembros de REDS y de SDSN, esa fuerte red de universidades, de actores locales, de sociedad civil que trabaja y conjuntamente para la implementación de los SDGs en nuestro país y que son especialmente activos. Un saludo desde Bruselas. Espero que tengamos ocasión de tener una interacción. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Guillaume, Vice President and Head of the Paris Office of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Of course, my dear friend and colleague Estivali Sáez, President of REDS-SDSN Spain, and Marta Ares, my friend, the Director of REDS-SDSN Spain, for their invaluable support and dedication in organizing this event. Thank you so much to the team also. I also wish to thank my colleagues from the European Parliament, Robert Biedron, Barry Andrews, and Andreas Kugla for accepting this invitation and for joining us today in this very crucial dialogue. Thank you also to Gonzalo Fanjul, my dear friend, to Marta Iglesias and Carlos Botella for being here, because your perspective from research and civil society are very, very important for us. And also thanks to Helen Viñas from the Platform on EU Sustainable Finance, who is following us online. The first message I want to bring to this discussion is one of urgency. The SDGs were set with a clear deadline, and we know that we are behind. If we do not act now, we will see more disasters caused by climate problems, like the terrible floods that recently affected my region, the Valencian community, for example. We are living in a time of public crisis, not only in terms of development cooperation. We are also living a crisis in how institutions, governments, and civil society across the world are positioning themselves on the SDGs. In this context, financing is a central challenge, one that requires not only greater resources, but also a rethinking our strategies and structures. The second message that I want to emphasize is that we need to do more and recommit ourselves to the SDGs. As European, we committed to our European Green Deal, the plan we created to protect and achieve precisely these goals. Our commitment to this plan must remain unwavering. Our security depends on it. When we ignore global issues like education, global health, gender equality, or peace, everyone suffers, including us. The Committee on Development and Environment are now working on key reports on SDGs and financing for development in preparation for the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville. The report is key to reinforce the European Union's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN 2030 Agenda. The International Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla represents a critical milestone for the global development agenda. As the world faces overlapping crises, from climate change and conflict to economic instability and mounting debt in low-income countries, it's clear that the current financing architecture is no longer fit for purpose. We must acknowledge both the complexity of the challenge and the cost of inaction. Financing for development must evolve. We must embrace a bold, inclusive, and sustainable approach. More than that, we need a new narrative, a clear shared vision that defines development finance not as an optional path, but as the only road to global equity and resilience. This means mobilizing significantly more resources, not only from public institutions, but also from private sector actors, while ensuring that these flows align with the Sustainable Development Goals. The European Union, as a major donor and global actor, must play a leadership role. This includes enhancing the transparency and effectiveness of its external investments, including under Global Gateway and pushing for debt relief. Sevilla must not be just another conference. It must be a turning point. Political will, thoughtful reflections, and global cooperation will take the key drivers if we want to close the development financing gap and advance Agenda 2030 and beyond. In this context, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure, my big pleasure, to welcome my colleague Guillaume, Vice President and Chief of the Paris Office of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who will now present the SDSN European Sustainable Development Report 2025. Thank you so much.
Lere, first of all, thanks to you and to your colleagues at SDSN Spain. And you mentioned all the names, so I will not go through all the names, but a big thank you for organizing this event, which I think in terms of timing couldn't be better, no? Because we're a few weeks away, as you said, from the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which will be hosted by a European country, Spain, but also in Europe a few weeks away from the presentation of the draft multi-annual financing framework. And I think what I'll try to do today is to connect a little bit the two discussions, because there's of course a lot of challenges, as you said, Lere, that actually go beyond the financing challenges in Europe, but that also connect to the global financial architecture, whether we speak about global security, climate change, the disruption caused by new technologies, and so on. So I think the two are very much related. So what I'll try to do today is to share a few thoughts on those two forthcoming events, but perhaps just, I'm the vice president of the largest network of researchers and scientists mobilized for sustainable development, the SDSN. So I'm going to share my sources for today's discussion. And I would say there's probably three, perhaps four major sources of information in case some of you want to dig a little bit deeper. So there is indeed the Europe Sustainable Development Report 2025, which was published last January. This is not the fruit only of the SDSN, but of a large consortium of partners and stakeholders. This is a spin-off of a global assessment that we do each year on the situation of the SDGs, and we've been doing this since 2016. So we will publish the next edition on the 24th of June, 2025, the global report card on the SDGs. And then two other pieces that connect with basically short-term developments. which have been published in the academic literature. This includes a piece where I was the lead author, The US is Against the World on Sustainable Development, which was published last month. And then also a piece published in the MIT Press Publishing on quantifying support for UN-based multilateralism. Before diving into the topic that I love, economics and financing for development, I think it's worth it to take just a quick step back and look at the big picture about three main contextual points that I'd like to make that I think are relevant in the current context. First of all, we are facing unprecedented levels of global systemic risks since basically the end of World War II. And this is not my opinion. This is actually the opinion provided by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that publish each year the Doomsday Clock. And they've been doing this each year in January. They update the clock, and now we are 89 seconds away from midnight, midnight being the self-destruction of humanity. By the way, initially this was focusing only on nuclear threat. Now they incorporate the risk of climate change and technological disruption, including AI. So to connect to the topic of the day, this obviously has major implications on the topic of achieving sustainable development and financing sustainable development. First of all, because there's direct humanitarian impacts, also environmental, by the way. War is also harming the environment, and the footprint of military is very large, but it also erodes the trust that is needed internationally to cooperate in order to tackle climate issues and the SDGs. And obviously, it's also a distraction from achieving the policies and a distraction of resources away from some of those objectives. We see it here in Europe also in terms of the budget trade-offs with the likely rise in military expenditure in the coming years. With a small share of the global budget on military, I would actually say only the US military budget would take us very far actually in achieving the SDGs. The second point that I want to make on context is the fact that we are basically witnessing during this decade, I would say, even though it started before, the emerging or re-emerging of a multipolar world. And this is, of course, you know, the famous, I'm a big fan of the Madison's long-term GDP series, and this is the share of world GDP that you can see over the very long time. And just to cut it short, basically the parts in red and in orange are basically China and India. Those two countries used to be, for a large chunk of humans' history, very large powers. Of course, you know, in the case of India, since the late 18th century with the control by Great Britain, the share of GDP declined. And in the case of China, it's since 1839 and the first Opium War. But it's no surprise that these countries are rising now in terms of major powers. Just from a demographic standpoint, it makes complete sense. Now, this has also implications for how I believe Europe conducts diplomacy. I think it becoming harder to impose things on certain countries. And I also think it requires a new approach to promoting, and we've been using the concept for many years of SDG / EGD, European Green Deal diplomacy, with many parts of the world, including China, including India, including Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, and other parts of the world. It is basically in this decade that not only do we need to make major breakthroughs to address those so-called irreversible tipping points, but also it's in this decade that the share of world GDP of the BRICS basically surpasses the share of the GDP of the G7 countries. The third contextual point that I'd like to make is the fact that we need to acknowledge today that although 193 countries committed to achieving the SDGs in 2015, and this commitment was countries recommitted to this at the Summit of the Future, we now have explicitly one country that opposes this agenda, and this is the United States of America. This was done on the 4th of March in the context of a discussion around a UN resolution, which was put forward by Bahrain on making the 28th of January the International Day of Peaceful Coexistence. And I'm not going to read the full statement, but I think the end of that statement is very important in the context actually of the Seville conference. The statement by the US delegate says, therefore, the United States rejects and denounces the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and it will no longer reaffirm them as a matter of course. So this is very clear. from our perspective, and this is what the piece in Nature is saying, is this is not the view of US states, cities, to a large extent, civil society. By the way, it's also not the reflection of the US historical role vis-a-vis UN processes. I mean, after the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor played a major role in shaping up the UN system. So it might be a capture, but I think we need to acknowledge it very clearly today that the US will not push this agenda forward. And the one thing, and there's two, by the way, slides that I will go quickly through the next two slides, but basically just to say that 190 countries have published today a UN voluntary national review. 3 countries have not. The 3 countries are Haiti, Myanmar, and the United States of America. India published 3 VNRs, China, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, 2 VNRs. So there is engagement. 95% of the world population lives in a country that is committed or at least shows some signs of engagement with the SDGs. The US position does not reflect what the rest of the world is thinking. The other point, and this is also a by the way slide, so you can look at the full article, but the US rejection of UN-based multilateralism is actually not completely new. The difference now is that it's very explicit. The reality, and this is just one indicator that we've been using, this is the share of votes aligned with the rest of the international majority at the UN General Assembly. And we've looked at this, more than 5,000 resolutions. What you can see here, the line in black is the United States, basically voting with the rest of the international community a quarter of the time, essentially because it votes against the rest of the community on issues such as the Israel-Palestine issues, financing for development, UN reform, collective security resolutions, and issues around unilateral sanctions, among others. By the way, the only other country that comes close to this 25% is Israel. So I've put in front of you the declaration from the US government. This is the priorities and principle of this European leadership, at least from the European Council Strategic Agenda 2024-2029 and the mission letters to commissioners designate. So the strategies of the European Council document says that we will uphold the United Nations and principal enshrined in the UN Charter and promote the SDGs in all international fora. The mission letters of the Commission says that members of the College will ensure the delivery of the SDGs. My point here is, how do you reconcile this with the US declaration in the context of CVE, for instance? We will emphasize the SDGs in all international fora, the US deciding that. So I think my view is that perhaps we need to rethink the idea of unanimity in these kinds of international negotiations, at least temporarily. Otherwise, the risk is to water down any outcome documents. This might be temporary, but I think I think it would be a better solution than simply erasing the term SDGs, sustainable development, climate action, and other terms like this. Regarding the situation globally, and Leire is very right when she says that we're obviously not on track. So each year we track the performance of all UN member states on this agenda. None of the goals are on track to be achieved. You see it here. Some goals are more off track than others. Of course, less than 20% of all of the targets will be achieved. And this is largely due to conflicts, geopolitical tensions. In my mind, a lot of man-made crises, which hopefully can be solved by men and women. Failures in global governance, especially on the financing side. And let's remember that in the developing world, half of the world population lives in a country that spend more on servicing the debt than on health or education. And so this goes to the point that Leire was mentioning, the importance of CVE. In Europe, the challenges that we've been highlighting for years are quite clear on the SDGs. So this global report that I mentioned, we also bring it down to Europe as well. And we see 3 main challenges in Europe. First of all, slow progress on the environmental and biodiversity goals. Second, stagnation or reversal of progress on some socio-economic aspects. And third, the issue of cohesion, the slow convergence across European regions, and the growing productivity gaps, notably with the US, in a context, as we have seen with the Draghi report, where there's a number of demographic, economic, financial, geopolitical challenges also that lie ahead for Europe. These are the kinds of data that we've put forward, but basically out of 4 dimensions of this Leave No One Behind index that we publish every year, there's basically been reversal in progress and stagnation on 3 out of 4 pillars: poverty and material deprivation, income inequality, access to and quality of services. So it's not the status. Europe remains the leader internationally on this agenda, but the trends, the dynamics are not necessarily very positive, especially over the past 3 to 4 years. And this is the cohesion, the convergence question that you see here. This is the number of years that would be required for each sub-regions in Europe to catch up with the most advanced region in Europe, Northern Europe. So you see here that it's more than 20 years for Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and in the case of candidate countries, which we also incorporate in this pan-European report, it's more than 60 years that would be needed to catch up with Northern Europe. So, you know, in the context of the MFF, of course, the question of the cohesion policy remains obviously a very important topic. It's not that there's no convergence, but basically that it's going slowly. At the same time, and I'm going to close very shortly, but at the same time, I think that Europe has a lot of advantages. If we look at global perspective, 19 out of the top 20 countries in the world are actually European countries on the SDG index. The only country that makes it in the top 20 is Japan. We also contribute at SDSN to the World Happiness Report. Europeans are the happiest people in the world. And I think there's a reason for this, is because Europe cares about these issues. As a reminder, Europe did not wait for the SDGs to incorporate sustainable development in the Treaty of Lisbon, which is mentioned explicitly in 2007. In terms of advantages, obviously the single market, a healthy, educated population. Half of the top world universities are also in Europe when we think about innovation and productivity. One of the issues is, of course, the fragmented capital markets. There's large European savings, and I think later you were talking about this just now, the mobilization of private savings that are not used for investments in Europe, but to invest abroad. And we have young talents and entrepreneurs that often leave Europe in order to innovate. And so I think here the discussions around the savings union and the capital market union, the banking union, are absolutely crucial. I will close with this slide, which are just based on everything that I've said now, just thoughts on priorities to finance the SDGs globally and in Europe by 2030 and mid-century. So, you know, first of all, just to put a bit of a scale on the challenge, I mean, the UN Commission on Trade and Development estimates that the global SDG financing gap annually is about $4 trillion USD per year. This is a large amount for you, for me, but at the scale of the global economy, this is 4% of global output and a small portion of global savings, which are about 30 trillion USD a year. Obviously, this amount, when you bring it down to national GDP, it could be equivalent to 20 or 30% of GDP in developing countries. So domestic resource mobilization alone will not do it. And we have ODA obviously in retreat, as we have seen from the OECD data a few weeks ago. So the reform of the global financial architecture, which is essentially this complex system that brings savings to sustainable investment, is absolutely crucial. I'll go quickly through the various points, but essentially I think number one priority for CIVI is to have an ambitious outcome document that does make reference to SDGs, 2030 agenda, climate action, and the reform of the global financial architecture beyond domestic resource mobilization. Second, a substantial increase in long-term and affordable funding from multilateral development banks, could be through paid-in capital, but also the direct borrowing from markets. The point here is that those MDBs have a better credit rating than their individual member countries. The third point is funding the institutions established to safeguard the global common. Actually, I would say funding adequately the UN itself, but also the Global Environment Facility, the Loss and Damage Fund, and other funds through perhaps international taxation, could be on shipping, aviation, and others. There's been interesting development a few weeks ago at the International Maritime Organization on the taxation of shipping, for instance, which was achieved, by the way, through coalitions of the willings. My fourth point is on the reform of the regulation of the private capital markets, including revamping of the credit rating system and the IMF World Bank debt sustainability framework to increase the flows of capital to high return investment in low-income countries. And of course, and this is what we do at SDSN to a large extent, support national pathways, long-term investment policy, monitoring frameworks at the country level, so that we have institutions planning that can deliver with the financing that back these pathways. On Europe, I think one of the questions these days, at least I'm following this from further away than you, but I think there's a question around the size of the budget. I understand that the MFF last time was about 1% of EU's GDP. Now, I think if you add the MFF plus the next gen EU, including the Recovery and Resilience Facility, I think it was closer than 2% of EU's GDP than 1%. The question is, now that we've had the Draghi report, now that we know that there's a lot of investment needed, there's been the rearmament plan, of course, this idea of making a few champions and having a few champions in Europe on new technologies, AI, large language models, obviously the net zero carbon system, and the technologies for precise agriculture, the cohesion policy. Is it achievable with a 1% of the EU's GDP for the next MFF? That, in my mind, is a question mark. Second point is, and I think here I would echo what Leire was saying, the European Green Deal, in my mind, remains the right long-term strategy for Europe, for the industrial policy, geopolitical policy, environmental policy. Because Europe is vulnerable to climate change, Leire mentioned it, but also because the rest of the world is moving forward. We've had recent commitment from China and Brazil going in that direction. Brazil, of course, hosting the COP30 at the end of the year. So I would be very cautious when it comes to watering down some of the agreements and the regulations. And I think here the paper from the European Central Bank, or the opinion that was issued a few days ago, is actually very interesting, because this is not SDSN or an NGO saying it. Is the European Central Bank saying to legislators, be careful when it comes to scaling down the scope of the CSRD or the CSDD, because we still need to achieve those objectives. And I would mention that China just presented a few weeks ago a draft sustainable disclosure standard. So China is moving forward on those issues, and I think the European Green Deal should remain the main compass for development in Europe. The third point is, and I mentioned it, mobilizing large private European savings. Some of you might have seen the article in the Financial Times from this morning. I think this is absolutely key. This is not a new issue, but there is momentum right now, and I think this is absolutely crucial for Europe to mobilize the large private savings and increase the size of venture capital markets, for instance. Scale up the global gateway, obviously, and come up with win-win partnerships with the EU's neighboring countries and other countries, the Western Balkans, North Africa, Sahel, Central Asia. I think there's been a lot of announcements around the global gateway, but I think the firepower needs to come from this MFF 2028, 2035. And finally, and I think I'll close with this, I think diplomacy remains a very cost-effective strategy in general. War is extremely costly. I think it's in the EU's DNA. I'm European, I'm also Canadian, so I think it's in our DNA to be honest brokers when it comes to dealing with conflicts. And I think perhaps in this emerging multipolar world, a smart diplomacy goes beyond the issue of sanctions and needs to also take some other ways as well. So I think I'll end there. Thank you again, Leire, for organizing this important and for the very good timing for this event. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Guillaume, for sharing with us the main conclusions of this report and your personal reflections. Thanks, Leire, for your inspiring and thoughtful reflections as well. And now I would like to invite the panelists of the second part of this session. REDS, Red Española de Desarrollo Sostenible, is the Spanish chapter of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And this year, we proudly celebrate our 10th anniversary. This milestone reinforces our ongoing commitment to fostering multi-stakeholder spaces. These spaces facilitate the exchange of ideas, knowledge, and experiences among political institutions, academia, civil society, and the private sector. Organizing today's event and hosting this discussion panel is one of the ways we ensure that our work has real impact and continues to drive momentum around the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in Europe. Addressing the challenges of sustainable development and its financing requires more than general consensus. It demands open, honest dialogue that acknowledges tensions, identifies gaps, and explores opportunities for collaboration. The objective of this panel is to build bridges between diverse perspectives in order to shape a shared vision and move forward urgently and ambitiously towards a truly sustainable future. We are honored to welcome the group of panelists that join us today. Robert Biedron, he's a member of the European Parliament with the Progressive Alliance for Socialists and Democrats, a long-time advocate for human rights and sustainability. He plays a key role as co-reporter on the SDGs, pushing for stronger European action on the 2030 Agenda. Barry Andrews, he represents Ireland in the European Parliament as part of the Renew Europe group. He focused on global partnerships, aid effectiveness, and aligning European Union's external action with the Sustainable Development Goals. It was scheduled, but unfortunately, it was not possible, the attendance of Andras Kulja. Because of personal issues, we wish to send a very warm greeting for him. Marta Iglesias, she is the Director of Advocacy and Strategy at the Peace Movement, MPTL. She leads this movement's efforts to promote peace, human rights, and sustainable development. And finally, Gonzalo Fanjul, he is the Director of Policy and Development at IS Global. He's a development economist and policy expert with deep expertise in global health, inequality, and evidence-based advocacy. Thank you very much for being here. And now we are going to start our discussion with the first question, in which you have more or less 4 minutes to answer.
All of us.
All of you. And we are going to start with Barry. Based on your experience, what are the main structural or political barriers currently hindering SDGs implementation? And on the other hand, and to be a little bit more positive, what successful practices or progress have you observed that could inspire us for future action? So let's start with the negative part, and in the second part, the positive things or the positive practices that you have identified.
So let's start with the negative with Barry. Who better to give a negative assessment than myself? Now, first of all, Lara, thank you so much for inviting me to this event. And it's great to see Guillaume again. In the last mandate, we worked a lot on SDG implementation. So, I mean, the answer remains the same for me, that at a governance level, it's really important that we would have far better political buy-in in the Commission. It is true, as pointed out, that the mission letters require all of the commissioners to think about the SDG delivery. But when it's everybody's issue, it's nobody's issue, frankly. And this is unfortunately an issue we pushed in the last mandate, but were unsuccessful in finding a single commissioner who had responsibility for the SDGs. The second issue is that there is no implementation plan at an EU Commission level for the SDGs. And again, it's been regularly raised in our resolutions in the European Parliament that we feel it would be a good idea, given the very clear targets and objectives and the voluntary national review carried out by the European Union, that it would be a good idea to have an implementation plan, which would be something that we could then apply some scrutiny and transparency to delivering. And of course, the other issue is finance. And what we're seeing is an MFF process now, which is really, really difficult because there's a global problem whereby, first of all, the timing of it. So this is an MFF from 2028 to 2035. So essentially, it's for a different commission and a different parliament. So we're planning beyond our own mandate. And we don't know what that complexion of that commission and parliament is going to be like. It could be very, very much, I would say, worse than the current one. It could be much more right-wing. There could be an even more greater majority on that side. So we are designing a 7-year budget for a political framework we don't really know much about. And that's a real worry. So the budget has been designed by people who are trying to keep relationships between now and 2029. They don't really care about the period afterwards. So we have to anonymize this budget politically. We have to be very careful in how the architecture of the budget looks like. The second problem is, as Guillaume pointed out, 1% of our GNI. It's just completely inadequate. Nobody wants more own resources. Let's be clear about it. Nobody wants to make higher contributions. Very few want to see mutual debt increased. We still have to pay interest on ORF, and we have much greater pressures on Ukraine, and security, and defense, and competitiveness. So what does that leave you then in terms of, and we want to keep cohesion and agricultural payments. So you're dealing with a vanishingly small amount of money that the European Union can apply to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you asked me for the negative, and you got the negative. So on the positive side, Europe is the world's last great hope. And I would just comment on Guillaume's point about the US. I don't believe the US ever took seriously the Sustainable Development Goals. That's why Biden never carried out a voluntary national review. There was never any appetite for this. But the US is, this does happen at sub-national level, sub-federal level in the US. There's lots of mayors and governors who very much take seriously the SDGs. And the same is happening in Europe at local level, municipal level, the mayor of Paris famously, who really do take these things seriously. So look, I'll just finish on that just with an overall picture of where I see things at the moment.
Thanks a lot for the negative aspects, but also for the positive things. And it's true that we take seriously the SDGs. Now, I would like to know what's your perspective from the social cohesion point.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Lyra, and happy anniversary for 10 years. It's a long time. I hope you continue your good work. So yeah, I think the most important thing is that there is no plan B for SDGs. And many people don't understand that we don't have other plan than SDGs. Globally, there is no other idea functioning for the solutions SDG is providing. The commitment of 193 countries devoted to the goals, it's the achievement which is unprecedented in the human history. We never ever had managed to deliver a plan like that. So I think it's very important to understand that the threat is serious, because if we are to talk about the barriers on SDGs, I think it's very dangerous that there is a lack of political leadership and more and more irresponsible politicians using the SDGs agenda to play the games and have SDGs, besides other issues like Green Deal mentioned before, as scapegoats in their political competition, in the political games. And this is what we are seeing also here in this house more and more, that SDGs became politicized in this populist way. And I think this is one of the dangers, that when you become using this kind of tools, which for a long time have not been used this way, the harm is really deep. in that. And we see it in US, but we see it also in Argentina with the Milei administration. There are also declarations. So I think this is the danger. The wave of misinformation on SDGs and on those issues is tremendous. And I think I would see this as a biggest harm. And it's a paradox, because when we talk about SDGs, we see those are the issues people usually support, like the issues concerning Europe. The colleague before was speaking about environmental issues, social, economic, zero hunger. We all agree on that. We all agree on that. But somehow there are politicians who are able to reverse these things which are our common concerns, where this is such a huge social support against these ideas. And this phenomenon, from my perspective, I think it's one of the biggest threats. And when we are talking about next MMF, which Barry and some of you before mentioned, I think this will be one of the main threats, that it will be hijacked by these people to water down this. And speaking about good example, well, I come from Poland, and there is a success story about SDGs, SDG 5 on gender equality. For many years, gender equality was one of the scapegoats of the previous government. Polish government introduced the most strict anti-abortion legislation. There was this pregnancy register where all the pregnancies, like in The Handmaid's Tale, were registered. Every woman was followed if she's not terminating abortion illegally. And then civil society, people self-organized so much that it created the movement, which at the end of the day has changed the political course in Poland, because it was the women in Poland mainly who voted the new government. And I think this is a positive example of how we can, through civil society, fight for these goals. And of course, it's not easy. We need 300 years to reach full gender equality around the world. 60 years in Europe. We need to in this pace to reach gender equality. We will sooner land on Mars than reach gender equality in Europe. Imagine, it's estimated that we sooner reach on the Mars than, but Poland is closer to it because of the strong civil society. So I think European Union should lead by example, that it was said. What happens in European Union doesn't stay in European Union. So I'm happy we are working now, and I'm co-rapporteur on the report for next high-level political forum in New York on SDGs. I'm happy that I hope we will have a strong statement on that, because who if not us? Who if not European Union will lead by example? This is our obligation, because this union was built on the values. SDGs are built as well. We share the same values, we share the same responsibilities, and we, as the second democracy by population in the world, European Union is the second democracy by population in the world, we should lead by example in that. Thank you.
Thanks to you. You mentioned that Europe was built on the values. Your perspective on the value of SDGs is incredibly valuable. What's your perspective, Marta, from the civil society? I think that perhaps very similar, but do you have the same perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this event. Thank you, lady, for the invitation. Yeah, I think voy a hablar en español, casi mejor, si nos importa. Hay traducción. Creo que vamos a coincidir en muchos de los análisis. Es un reto resumir las barreras y alguna experiencia positiva en 4 minutos, pero quizá algunas barreras. Yo creo que cuando hablamos de la Agenda 2030, y ha salido, ¿no?, en la primera intervención, no nos terminamos de creer o de entender que realmente tiene que ser una apuesta política al más alto nivel, que tiene que haber voluntad política para hacerlo realidad, ¿no? Mencionábamos, no hemos conseguido que haya un comisario, una comisaria que asuma la Agenda 2030 porque parece ser que tenemos que dedicarnos a las políticas domésticas, a las políticas de la acción exterior y luego están los ODS, cuando en el fondo los ODS podrían y deberían ser la hoja de ruta política. Ahí tenemos todo, el bienestar para las políticas domésticas y también para las políticas globales. Quizás esto es algo que no hemos conseguido explicar adecuadamente y que nos cuesta entender. Lo vemos como algo aparte y no como algo estructural, ¿no?, y como el pilar de la política. Barreras que estamos teniendo, porque yo creo que hemos avanzado, pero seguimos teniendo piedras en el camino. Cuando hablamos de la Agenda 2030 nos cuesta hacer entender que cuando hablamos de desarrollo sostenible hablamos de 3 dimensiones que no se pueden separar, lo social, lo económico y lo ambiental. Parecía que lo habíamos conseguido, parecía que esto estaba claro, pero de repente en un plumazo hay un cambio en la comisión y de repente vemos que lo social y lo ambiental de repente se nos van perdiendo. Y vemos que lo económico parece ser que es lo más importante y no nos damos cuenta que para también avanzar y para conseguir una Europa competitiva en lo económico necesitamos que en el mundo también lo económico, lo social y lo ambiental vayan de la mano porque tenemos retos globales y por lo tanto tenemos que tener respuestas globales. Tenemos crisis entrelazadas y por lo tanto las respuestas tienen que estar entrelazadas. Vinculado con esto, otra de las barreras que yo creo que estamos teniendo es que hemos considerado la Agenda 2030 como los 17 objetivos. Pero se nos olvida que parte de la clave para mí de la Agenda 2030 y para nosotras es la coherencia de políticas. No podemos hablar de los 17 objetivos si no entendemos que tenemos que mirar la política y la forma de hacer política de una manera completamente diferente, una manera diferente de diagnosticar qué es lo que nos pasa, de mirar esas interrelaciones y, por lo tanto, de hacer política de una manera coherente e interrelacionada. No solo porque es la única manera de hacerlo, sino porque es la manera más eficaz. Si tenemos políticas que van en una dirección y otras en la contraria, estamos gastando recursos. Aunque solamente sea por la cuestión de la eficacia, es imprescindible que empecemos a utilizar la coherencia de políticas como nuestra hoja de ruta, ¿no?, y nuestra guía para afrontar la política. Otra de las cosas, quizá de las barreras, es que se nos olvida que, y hemos conseguido que haya conseguimos en su momento, ¿no?, que hubiera un objetivo 16 vinculado con la paz, pero todo lo que significa la democracia y la paz, para mí casi es un objetivo habilitante de todos los demás, ¿no? Hablamos de la triple transición económica, social y ambiental, pero la democrática y la de la paz es casi tan importante. Para mí serían casi 4 dimensiones, teniendo en cuenta que esta es la habilitante para todas las demás. Hemos dado por sentada la democracia, hemos dado por sentada la paz y nos estamos dando cuenta que eso fue quizá un error. Entonces, ¿cómo le damos mucha más importancia a esto? Otra barrera, quizá la parte de la participación y luego, de hecho, el caso práctico, el ejemplo inspirador, me voy a centrar en esta parte, porque también es verdad que cuando construimos políticas contando con la ciudadanía, serán siempre políticas mejor enfocadas, pero además políticas que tendrán el respaldo de la ciudadanía y que será mucho más difícil de construir. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos que esa participación de todos los actores involucrados sea realmente estructurada y esté garantizada de la mejor manera posible? Es otra de las cosas que quizá también con la Agenda 2030 nos ha pasado. Y quizá por terminar, me gustaría resaltar la parte de narrativas. Creo que con la parte de las narrativas, si bien es cierto que la Agenda 2030 hace un gran esfuerzo comunicativo para acercar y hacer entender la agenda, nos ha costado quizá explicar un poquito más esa parte positiva y posibilista, ¿no? Yo doy clase en la universidad y muchos de mis alumnos me dicen, ya, pero Marta, si es que esto nunca se va a conseguir, ¿qué sentido tiene? No pasa nada, si es que el objetivo no solamente es que se consigan, por supuesto, queremos que se consigan, pero es que el proceso de la forma diferente de hacer y de estar ya merece la pena porque ya nos va a generar un cambio. Muchas veces la manera en la que lo hemos contado directamente nos desactiva y los alumnos me dicen, es que si no se va a conseguir, ¿para qué intentarlo?, ¿no? Esto es importante y yo creo que esto añadido a, y lo ha comentado, creo que ha sido Leire o Guillermo al principio, la importancia también porque estamos en un momento en el que la agenda está siendo atacada. Está siendo atacada como instrumentalización de un discurso y de una visión del mundo diferente, donde parece ser que lo nuestro está en oposición con lo de los demás. Y la Agenda 2030 viene a decir justo lo contrario, no hay nada de lo nuestro si no conseguimos que todos en el planeta tengamos acceso a esos derechos. Termino con una cuestión positiva, inspiradora. Justo ayer celebrábamos en el Congreso de los Diputados español los 2 años de la aprobación de la Ley de Cooperación al Desarrollo en España. Y lo pongo como ejemplo porque ha sido una ley que ha sido muy participada, que ha tenido la posibilidad y la capacidad, porque la hemos trabajado de manera lenta, y sobre todo porque de hace mucho tiempo, y en esto Leire tiene mucha responsabilidad, se estableció un sistema de participación estructurado, donde todos los actores, sector privado, sociedad civil, sindicatos, academia y, por supuesto, los diferentes niveles de la Administración, tenían un espacio para debatir, reflexionar y compartir sobre cómo teníamos que avanzar en la política de cooperación. Hace 2 años conseguimos esta ley completamente participada, donde todos los ministerios, todos los grupos políticos, salvo uno de la extrema derecha, el resto, todos los grupos, y generar consensos en el Gobierno español no era, en el Estado español no era fácil. Fue una de las pocas leyes de la legislatura que se aprobó con esa amplia mayoría, gracias a todo ese trabajo participado de trasladar que todos los ámbitos de la política eran importantes en la política de cooperación. Se consiguió avanzar, se consiguió aprobar y a día de hoy seguimos poniendo en marcha todas las reformas normativas que esto ha llevado. Así que, bueno, tendríamos más, pero no me quiero extender. Por respetar los tiempos, me quedo aquí. Gracias.
Gracias a ti, Marta. Muchísimas gracias. Y para acabar con esta ronda, nos gustaría contar con las reflexiones de Gonzalo Fonjul.
Gracias, Estíbaliz. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the invitation to the organizers. The Barcelona Institute of Global Health is, as the name says, an institution focusing on health. Health is much more than the SDG 3. We like to call it SDG 3+, and we work on a number of the determinants of the social and environmental determinants that affect health rights in the SDGs agenda. No? And to say that the road has been bumpy since 2015, I think is an understatement when we talk about the objectives related to global health. Particularly the COVID-19 pandemic flattened the curves, and what we've seen is a hit from which we have not really recovered since then. And actually, what we have seen in the last years, both in terms of the magnitudes of financing and the political traction, and I think that the pandemic treaty that has just agreed that the WHO is a very good example of that. I think that we've been moving clearly slowly. No? If you look at the numbers of the end of 2024, according to the current status of the SDGs fulfillment, and these are numbers from the Sustainable Development Report, there are 9 million children extra that will die by 2030 that should not have died should the SDGs being implemented or fulfilled accordingly. No? But what is interesting is that all of this is a paradise in comparison with what has happened in the last few weeks and in the last 3 months, and what I believe could be an existential blow to the global health agenda. US aid cuts are already having a devastating effect in the global health objectives across the world, both in terms of access to retrovirals, child survival, food aid, humanitarian assistance. Wherever you look at, every single of the targets related to global health are being affected, apart from many others. No? Should the Trump administration go ahead with the plans that they have already announced, and that as you very well know, are being challenged in court and in many other ways? According to an estimate that IS Global published last week, which is still a preprint in the Lancet, but it is an estimate that I believe that we will stick with, the number of additional deaths between now and 2030 will be 14.5 million people between now and 2030. This is to give you a reference that is very used lately. 2.5 holocausts that are taking place as a result of what the US is doing. 4.5 million of those deaths will be children under 5, most of them related to respiratory and diarrheal diseases. No? And the problem is that rather than fighting and counterbalancing these effects, What we are observing in Europe is that Europe is adding to the problems created by the United States, where the UK has announced a cut of 40% in their aid budgets. France has announced a cut of around a third in the aid budgets. We cannot imagine that Germany will continue providing the same level of aid that they have in the last years, and on health they were the second most important donor. And the problem of this is that in each of these cases, all the concerns were completely legitimate. You could, I mean, in the case of France, I mean, there was a reference to the internal economic problems. In the case of in the case of the UK, something similar. In every single case, a reference has been made to the need to increase defense spending in the light of what is happening in Ukraine and in other places. But what is appalling, in my view, is the way aid has been simply erased from the debate with almost no discussion and almost no contestation in any of these countries. And this is what I believe is a fundamental challenge in our countries. Despite of what the numbers say or the surveys say about public opinion support to aid policies, the fact is that you can get rid of them. You can risk the unprecedented progress of the international community in the last 30 years without almost no contestation or no response in our own countries. No? And this takes me to the inspiring example that I wanted to mention today. And well, Larry knows it very well. I'm not normally in the use of praising my own government, but I must say that in this case, our government must be praised. And what is happening in Spain is actually something that we should be following very closely, because Spain is swimming against the current, is swimming against the tides now in the European Union. Just to mention some of the things that are happening these very weeks right now when it comes to global health in Spain, the government is about to approve a global health strategy in our country, which would be the fifth in the European Union. Our Minister of Health is about to become a member of the Executive Council of the WHO, which is going to give Spain more political traction. This government has already showed what can be done in the negotiations of the pandemic treaty swimming against the current within the European Union. Spain, against what is happening in many other countries, has announced increases in the replenishment of Gavi, of the Global Alliance of Immunization, and hopefully this will be the same in the replenishment of the Global Fund. Spain is openly defending international humanitarian law in places like Palestine that are being where every single red line is being crossed by the international community. Again, appallingly, with the implicit support of some European countries, and sometimes very direct support, very explicit support of some European countries, and of course, Seville. Spain is going to be the co-host, is going to play, I hope, a very relevant role in providing political traction to the Seville conference. And this leadership, and as Marta, I think, has very rightly mentioned, is not happening just with one party or one coalition parties or one coalition of parties in government, but I believe that the Spanish society is behind that, and many other parties in Congress, with the exception of the very same people that are blocking everything in every other parliament in Europe, are actually providing support for the Spanish government in this regard. This is a treasure that we need to maintain, and what I hope is that we will continue in the coming years, no matter who is governing in Spain in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Gonzalo. Thank you, everyone, for your perspectives. We are a little bit run out of time, and I know that Barry has to leave us because he has to attend some other responsibility. We started with a negative question, then with a positive one, and now let me propose you a really difficult question. I would like to have the answer as a headline or a highlight in 1 minute. And the question is really difficult because it's from your point of view, what are the most critical shifts required to unlock the scale of international financing required, particularly in your area, but as a headline or a highlight?
I'd say debt. Sustainable debt is the most important thing. If you ask our partners in developing countries, they will say debt management, and it far exceeds what we donate in aid and foreign assistance. I think for ourselves as parliamentarians, the next MFF, we have to really, the aid budget is contained in an instrument called NDICI, and there are targets in there for gender equality and various other things, climate. I'm pretty sure the Commission want to remove those targets. And so I think health will be protected, frankly. I think the US want to protect health. I think the Commission wants to protect. I think everybody wants health because they're afraid of a global pandemic. And did they not invest in it? So I'm really concerned about cherry picking. You know, everyone's going to crowd into the easy stuff, the attractive stuff. So we need to really be careful about our MFF. It's really critical. And there's other problems with it and Global Gateway, but I think those two things, debt globally and here in the European Union, the MFF and targets within it, and how our guarantees are used as well beyond aid. So thank you again, Leira, and everybody. I'm sorry I have to slip away. Thank you.
Well, that's an easy exercise because I fully agree with Barry on that. No, I fully agree. There's 3.3 billion people living in the countries which spend more on paying back the debt payments than on health and education together. 3.3, half of the global population live in these countries. So this is a serious issue. And so it shows clearly that the actual international financial architecture is not fit for purpose. Just simply, it doesn't deliver. So I fully agree on that. But there would be two other issues. Then the first one, I think, crucial role of private sector. We need from it's estimated $2.5 trillion for financing the development gap. It's a lot of money, but the money are there. There are money, and I think the private sector is crucial. This morning, we were participating, some of us, I see Camille Bruckner with us. She's the director of the UN office in Brussels. And some of you, we were participating at this meeting in the Committee of Regions, where we were discussing the issues. And we know that there are money, like there is a private sector which has money, but still we did not probably done enough to reach this money. 2,700 billionaires have a total wealth of $14 trillion. They have the money, but they don't share this money with us. And we should find the ways how to encourage them to share this money. And last but not least, I mentioned local governments. I think this is crucial. Like 2/3 of SDGs are being deep down in these local governments, the little regions and places. So I'm a former mayor of the city, and I know how important it is that there will be also involved. This is not the case. We heard this morning that one of the main obstacles for local governments is lack of access to EU funds. Because the EU funds, it's complicated, you need to participate financially, many local governments cannot afford for that, and of course, it's very often politicized. So I come from Poland, and I can tell you, last year, 8 years, was a period of time where many local authorities were not receiving funds only because the mayor was elected from different political party. And this is not only a Polish example. This morning we heard examples from other countries. So the role of local authorities, the fiscal decentralization as well, and pushing on that will also help to rebuild the wealthy, healthy, new financing architecture for the needs we are discussing today.
Sí. Titulares también, y también es fácil porque comparto completamente lo que se ha dicho previamente. 3 ideas claras. Una, defensa del multilateralismo. Creo que de Sevilla tenemos que salir con un fuerte compromiso de que solamente juntas podemos salir de esto y defendiendo y apostando por el sistema multilateral, y vinculado con esto quizá una pequeña revisión a la arquitectura, ¿no? de financiación para el desarrollo que hasta ahora nos hemos dado, para que realmente sea una arquitectura y una estructura que nos permita recoger las necesidades y las propuestas por igual, ¿no? Quizá más equitativa con todos los países. Esta puede ser una línea. 2, deuda, completamente de acuerdo. Lo decía Biedron, 3,3 millones de personas viven en países, ¿no? en países que dedican más al pago de la deuda que a invertir en servicios sociales, y más de 100 países realmente están en crisis por causa de la deuda, y el 60% de esa deuda se la deben a entidades privadas, no públicas, que eso también es interesante, es importante tenerlo en cuenta. Entonces, una revisión del sistema de deuda, condonación, reestructuración fundamental. Y AOD, ¿no? Ayuda oficial al desarrollo. Creo que es importante, cuando hablamos de AOD, tenemos el famoso compromiso del 0,7, que no estamos llegando. Los últimos datos del Comité de Ayuda al Desarrollo del CAT del 24, que salieron hace poco, nos dicen que en Europa ha bajado un 8,6% el nivel de ayuda, y si hablamos en términos globales de cara al 25, con el anuncio de los recortes que estamos viendo en diferentes donantes, podemos llegar a un 17-19% de reducción de la AOD global. Esto tiene impacto, tiene nombres y apellidos de personas que se ven afectadas por estos recortes. Y aquí quizá dos reflexiones. Una, tenemos que dejar de llamar la ayuda. La ayuda parece que es algo que damos cuando nos sobran las cosas. La ayuda no es algo que nos sobra, no es una cuestión voluntaria, es una cuestión de compromiso y de corresponsabilidad fundamentalmente. Y porque además nuestro futuro y nuestra seguridad depende de la seguridad de todas las personas del mundo, seguridad de Estado, seguridad humana. Entonces, hablar también y trabajar la narrativa en temas de ayuda es importante, y también, lo decía Biedron muy bien, no instrumentalizada, ¿no? A veces estamos viendo cómo la ayuda está siendo instrumentalizada con objetivos políticos, también a veces con objetivos económicos. La ayuda al desarrollo, la solidaridad, no puede ser instrumentalizada para estar al servicio de bienes económicos o de cuestiones vinculadas con la migración. Entonces, esto es importante también trabajarlo en este sentido, para que de alguna manera sea algo coherente en toda su extensión.
So very quickly, 3 things. First of all, not dropping the ball on the commitments that are already being decided this year. And again, Gavi and Global Fund replenishments for us are completely critical, as well as the pandemic fund. Millions of lives are at stake in what is going to happen in June and later in the year, we don't know yet, possibly in November. No, that is the first one. Second, I will not repeat myself. I think that debt, together with multilateral loans, together with tax reforms, in order to unlock domestic resources, which are critical to finance global health priorities in many countries, particularly in low-income countries. No? But the third element that is critical for us, and we have a lot of expectations in Seville, at least as the starting point for this, is that I think that it is reasonable to think that whatever is going to happen after this shock will be a different system. It could be a complete, I mean, we could operate in the vacuum, or we could have a reform system that can address some of the fundamental problems that took us here even before Donald Trump, in terms of the exhaustion of the society with the aid system. And I think that global health is one particular area for reform that I think is critical. In Seville, we will have the opportunity to see in real life the problem of fragmentation when it comes to global health, and the number of UN organizations related to this, the number of global health initiatives that are, and there is going to be a fundamental conversation taking place that is already taking place in closed doors about what is going to happen with the global financing architecture system in the years to come. And this is related to what Guillaume said before about the global system in general. No, so I do hope that we have the opportunity to start that conversation. Not to, and I couldn't agree more about the need to work in the absence of unanimity, because we are not going to get that in this conference, but hopefully we will get get a substantial majority that can actually set the basis of the post-2030 development agenda, which is something that is already being discussed.
Thanks, Gonzalo. Thanks, Marta. Thanks, Robert. With these valuable reflections and diverse perspectives, but finally similar key points or conclusions, we conclude this panel.
Thank you.
We agree all the speakers, their contributions. And now, very quickly, we pass the word briefly to Carlos Botella. Carlos is a board member for cooperation of the governing board of the coordinating platform of development of NGOs in Spain and Eurodat, who is joining us online and is going to share some insights in the SDGs and the fourth conference on financing for development.
Hi, everyone. Could you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay. So first of all, let me start by thanking the organizers for having us, for inviting civil society representatives from the host country of the fourth conference on finance for development, which would take place in Seville, as it was mentioned previously, in Spain in a month or so. So my speech will focus on that, and because of the time constraint, I will focus on the specific recommendations for the EU. We as civil society organizations, we ask the EU some specific actions within this conference and the process of the conference and beyond the conference. One would be to promote changes in the international financing institutions and multilateral development banks towards a more democratic governance and rules. That one is one point. Another very broad point is on multilateralism. I think the EU should support UN treaties and conventions in some specific areas, such as international development cooperation, debt, but also on business and human rights, as it's happening now with the international cooperation on tax, so it could be done. And we think that will reinforce multilateralism and the UN as a democratic space where all countries have equal representation. So move some of the agendas to the UN. Would be desirable. Then on tax, I think the EU should support redistributive tax reform, and with a special focus on rich individuals and how to tax them and their income and wealth. So tax with a progressive perspective. On debt, as it was mentioned previously, and we are asking the EU for a UN debt regulation and to cancel unfair debt. On ODA, we think that the increase on South-South cooperation is good, that TOSDI is good as a potential instrument to bring light on the development finance, but they cannot erode ODA commitments. So we as CSOs, we are requesting a 0.0% of the GDP as a floor, not a ceiling on ODA. And at least we want a strong commitment with the 0.7, establishing a binding time framework to reach it. So a schedule to meet this commitment on ODI. And then on feminist financing, I think the EU should support the shift to substantial public resources to be allocated to finance comprehensive care systems. We also support that we use the gender approach on budgeting, planning and monitoring of public policies and services. And we have a specific target of ODA, a 20% of ODA towards or channeled through gender equality programs. for specific purposes on human rights defenders, women rights defenders, and feminist organizations. And then, sorry to be so quick and brief, but it's because of the time, but I have a couple of points on some EU-specific tools, the Global Gateway and the MFF. On the Global Gateway, I think we should see change in the goals of the Global Gateway, reaffirming the primary goals of the Global Gateway, which were poverty reduction worldwide, the sustainable development of the planet, solidarity and mutual respect among peoples, and also the protection of human rights. So these are the broader goals that the Global Gateway should achieve. And then finally, on the MFF, we see this process of the next MFF as a real way to walk the talk, to show US commitment to reduce both within and between countries inequality, to support sustainable development, gender justice, civic space, to tackle climate change and promote human rights. But the initial signs we are getting are not aligned with this purpose. We have seen like possible ODA cuts, the merge of some EU external action instruments, and almost an exclusive focus on private sector investment through the mentioned Global Gateway. But we think that there is still time to change the approach, and the EU can count on the civil society to do it. So thanks for this space. Let's take this unique opportunity in Seville to foster sustainable development, inequality reduction, and to strengthen multilateralism. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Carlos. Of course, let's take this opportunity. Now, and to close this session, we are pleased to hand over to Elena Viñes. She's the chair of the European Union's platform on sustainable finance. She is an expert in sustainable finance and responsible investment with extensive experience in aligning financial markets with the principle of the Sustainable Development Goals. She has played a leading role in various international initiatives focused on integrating environmental, social, and governance factors into financial decision-making. Elena also joins us online, and she will share very briefly some final remarks to help us project into the future that we want to collectively build here or the next month in Seville, the next month in Seville. Good afternoon, Elena. Buenas tardes.
Thank you so much. Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My challenge today is not only to shed some light into I call it the trillion-euro question, which is how do we finance the twin transition and Europe's other strategic priorities, but also to cut a speech that I had prepared of 15 minutes to 8 minutes. So I'll do my best on that. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was actually a little bit less ambitious, a little bit more modest, yes, incredibly challenging, which is on one hand, how do we mobilize private finance? And I'm going to focus on the private finance aspect. And on the other hand, how we make sure it flows what is needed. In my case, I'm going to really narrow it down to contributing to the EU Green Deal goals. So let's look at the first part of, and the previous speaker, Guillaume Lafortune, has already mentioned a couple of critical points. So I will go quite fast on this. Today, we face three major challenges in order to scale up finance and to unlock all the finance that exists, that in Europe's capital markets and in our European citizen savings accounts. The first one is fragmentation. We heard it over and over. We heard how, we like to think that we operate in a single internal market, but we actually operate in 27 regulatory regimes. And now it is very important to understand that while fragmentation affects all sectors, it particularly affects finance, and it's especially costly for finance because it limits our ability to fund our priorities. You know, the IMF has calculated that the internal barriers in Europe, are equivalent to 110%, equivalent of 110% tariffs on services. This is just not inefficiency. This is a massive drag on our competitiveness. At the same time, many times we question, Europe's ability to innovate. We don't have a problem on innovation, or at least it's not the main problem. We have many startups, many ideas, going from climate tech to artificial intelligence, but the problem is that promising companies hit the ceiling far too early. They can't scale, they cannot grow across borders, and many times, they are forced to leave Europe altogether. So in a nutshell, we need on one hand, reduce the differences in national regulations, supervision and implementation, and on the other hand, really get the depth and that, and capital pool that we need in order to grow. But I want to highlight one last point on these two challenges, which is now there is a clear desire to simplify and improve EU rules. Fine, but we need to be very rigorous and honest, and every time we look at an EU regulation, we need to ask ourselves, is the EU regulation the problem, or is it the only problem, or it's also the national divergence in that regulation, the difference of interpretation and implementation and supervision regarding that theme? So if we want a real and effective banking and capital markets union, we have to tackle both levels. Now, the third challenge is the untapped savings. If only in Europe we had the same, investment to deposit rates than in the US, we could redirect up to 8 trillion, into productive market-based investments. With that money, we could fund the green transition, we could fund many social objectives, we could fund the digital transition, SME growth, and even defense. I won't go into the list of a few recommendations that I wanted to share with all of you in the interest of time, but I really want to highlight not only that the Savings and Investment Union, it's a unique opportunity, a unique opportunity to mobilize the capital that we need, but that we really need to get it right. And in order to get it right, it's not the technical side that, will be an obstacle. It's the political will. Because in many of the areas that we're talking about, really integrating corporate law, for example, and the ways that, it requires a strong political will. And full harmonization will take time. A long time. So in the meantime, we should focus on where there is consensus, what's feasible, try to be as ambitious as possible, eliminate the inconsistencies, and work gradually towards convergence, and build, in that case, the trust and confidence that, that is needed to bring citizens and their capital into Europe's transformation. But what is also a message that I wanted to share with all of you is that the Savings and Investment Union alone will not be the answer. What we need is that the Savings and Investment Union, it fully integrates the sustainable finance framework, because this is a two steps, process. On one hand, we mobilize the capital, and then we make sure that that capital ends up where it needs to end up. And what the sustainable finance framework does is to direct the capital towards sustainable investments, direct the capital for the transition. And if you allow me, I'm going to highlight the importance on, investing in climate. I know the SDGs cover many other areas, but let me be very, very clear. climate change is first and foremost a social problem. And why we need to prioritize climate, it's simply because climate change, it's a multiplier of all the social and environmental problems that we face. So if we don't want, the task to triple or quintuple, we need to really tackle climate change. And with only 25 years left, we need to be very conscious that the most urgent thing is that all new investments, and taking into account the economic life of most of assets, infrastructure or equipment, need to be fit for purpose or will end up playing a much larger bill. And here is where the taxonomy comes into place. There's been a lot of criticisms towards the taxonomy. And yes, we are the first ones that have, issued a report with a list of issues that needs to change in order to make the taxonomy much, much more efficient. But let me highlight, despite all the problems, the taxonomy is starting to really work on the ground. And the biggest contribution of the taxonomy has been precisely on directing capital investments towards sustainable investments and towards the transition. And let me just share with you some of the figures, what the figures say. With only 2180 companies reporting, with only 2 years of reporting, the taxonomy has already mobilized 530 billion in climate mitigation investments from electrification, electricity production, distribution, and storage. Just a few weeks ago, with the 2025 reports on 2024 rolling in, this figure has already risen to 720 billion. In only 1 year, 2023, 250 billion, a 34% increase. More interesting than it's been the fact that there's starting to be reports from the sell side analysts that have identified a positive correlation between taxonomy alignment and financial market performance. That is, the taxonomy is actually helping to lowering the cost of capital for those companies that invest in alignment with the taxonomy. In addition, the EU climate benchmarks have now channeled 180 billion and I really want to highlight, because so many times it is oversight, 62% of European assets under management are today, have today sustainability characteristics or have a sustainable investment objective. This is, sustainable finance is not mainstream. It's the bulk of our market. And ESG has been one of the growing investment categories in the EU. And the EU has established itself as the global benchmark in sustainable finance. Our taxonomy has inspired 58 taxonomies around the world that they are in the making. This is 65% of the global GDP, operates under a taxonomy. Our sustainability reporting standards have influenced international norms. Europe is by and large, the biggest global market, when it comes to green bonds, and equally when it comes to the sustainable fund space, with nearly 2.7 trillion of global sustainable fund assets. Yeah, and many of you would be asking, well, but what about this backlash, on ESG? It's true. And we shouldn't underestimate it. But it's equally true that the largest pension funds in the US, from California and New York, have reaffirmed their commitments to climate action. In fact, they have made it very, very clear that, their intention to delegate the management of their assets to those committed to managing climate risk. And what we have seen in the past few weeks is some of the large pension funds, including from Europe and the UK, delegating assets to EU-based managers, withdrawing them from the US players. So we're seeing both movements at the same time. But let's be very, very clear, traditionally, European financial markets have, been outperformed by US markets. It's true, they're more competitive. But when it comes to sustainable finance, there is where we have a competitive edge. But we shouldn't take leadership, for granted, because Singapore, Hong Kong, and London, they're all looking to become the sustainable finance hub. It was mentioned before, but in Brussels, so many times people ignore how much policy development on sustainable finance has been happening, across the G20. Yes, not in the US, or shall I say, not at federal level, because in certain US states, yes, it has happened, but in many G20 countries, particularly in Asia, since 2020, policies related to sustainable finance have tripled in G20 countries. Now, the main reason, this is I'm coming to my conclusion, why I highlight so much the very fact that we have a competitive edge on sustainable finance, is because right now, with the within the current context, we are risking to throw the baby out with the bath waters. I cannot highlight how important it is for the market, for investor, for protecting their confidence, but also our leadership, but also for companies to be able to transition, the importance of quality, reliable, comparable, and meaningful information. Yes, the answer is not more reporting, but better, more targeted. But cutting the scope, by 80% is not the solution. We need one standard, comprehensive, with a reduced number of mandatory data points for the large companies and even a more reduced number for mid-size, but we need mandatory reporting, Let's, not lose our competitive advantage in sustainable finance, because we need sustainable finance in order to ensure that all that private finance is put to work, to contribute to the EU development and Green Deal goals. What we need is a savings and investment union that goes hand in hand with the sustainable finance framework. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the attention, and I did my best to summarize my speech.
Thanks, Elena. You did very well. I'm glad you mentioned the competitive advances on sustainable finance, the taxonomy, the good results of the last year, because this leaves us a good feeling at the end of this session. Thank you very much. As we come to close today's session, I would like to thank all of you for your thoughtful contributions and respectful engagement. A special thanks to David and Alison from the team of Leire Pajín, also to Carolina, Marta, and Alejandro of the team of the REDS team. Thank you very much, because without your help and without your support and time, this event was not possible. This exchange has once again shown the value of open dialogue and the strength of our democratic institutions. May the reflections shared here today continue to inspire and guide our collective efforts. Thank you for your attention, and this session is now formally concluded. Thank you very much.